Welcome everybody on what's turning out to be a very historic afternoon. It's a great day to be with what I feel like is my people, and maybe you all also feel like you're with your people. So thank you for taking the time to be here. As we have our third big reading of the MFA reading series of the semester with the alumna of our program, Ayşegül Savaş. I'm gonna have Carl will be doing some introductions, but for now I should thank the people that we need to thank, which of course is the deans of the College of Arts and Sciences for their support of this event. Yes, we can applaud them silently. Also, of course, Micah Ballard, our administrative director, and Kimberly Garrett, our program assistant, for all the work they do to organize and get these events going smoothly. As a reminder, I think almost all of you are on mute, so please keep yourself on mute. The chat is open, so you can use that, of course, courteously, if you please. And the chat is also open if you would like to ask questions. You can field them there. You can send them directly to Carl or just put them in the chat. I can moderate them and Carl can take a look as well. So without further ado, Carl, I'll give it over to you.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks to everyone who helped bring this event together. And of course, welcome Ayşegül from the countryside of France. So for those of you who are not familiar with our guest today, she is an alumna of our program. She's a Turkish writer living usually in Paris, although right now during the lockdown, we've learned she's in the countryside with friends. Her first novel, Walking on the Ceiling, was published in May of 2019 and got a lot of attention and a lot of really wonderful and thoughtful reviews. Her second novel, I'm told, is called White on White and forthcoming from Riverhead Books. Congratulations on having another one coming. The second one I think is harder somehow. Her writing has also appeared in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, Granta, The Guardian, The Dublin Review, and other places. So welcome, and everyone give a little welcome to Ayşegül here.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to see you. You know, it's silly to claim pride as a professor of a former student because, of course, we have very little to do with what you do with your life after you're with us. But it is always a really great feeling to just know that folks who studied with us and participated in our community have gone on to keep the writing life at the center of their lives and to publish. So yeah, we're all just beaming here. It's wonderful. Why don't you start off with a reading for us? I know you said you had a couple passages marked, and I think although I know some of our students here today have read the book, my class has been reading it and discussing it over the last 2 weeks. Others have read excerpts, some may not be familiar, but anything that you want to share with us for a start. I'll mute myself while you read and then pop back on to ask questions after you're done.
Okay, well, you know, I think I'll start by reading the introduction to the book for those of you who haven't read it, just to give you a sense of my narrator's voice. And I did want to talk to you a little bit about how this voice came about. And, you know, that gap between completing the MFA and completing a collection of short stories and then writing a novel. So here's the very short opening chapter. For a short time when I lived in Paris, I was friends with the writer M. He was a foreigner to the city too, which may have been one of the reasons for our friendship. We went on walks around the city and we wrote to each other. What remains of that time is a photograph of M standing in front of a marble wall, looking at me with bewildered eyes. Above his raised eyebrow, a pale and jagged scar rises, deepens, disappears. Actually, this may not be a scar at all, but a trick of the shadows or the author's face folded with age. I don't recall a scar from our walks, but I often walked alongside him with my head down. And I'm not sure whether his eyes are really cast up in surprise, as I said, and not simply with impatience at having his photo taken. Still, I remember M as always a bit bewildered, and with the scar on his eyebrow, a sign illuminated in that brief moment of documentation when he looked me straight in the eyes. But here too, my account is faulty, since between my eyes and his stood the comforting length of the camera lens. As far as I can remember, I never looked M in the eyes, even when we were seated across from each other at a cafe. Some days it's difficult to believe that this friendship really existed, with its particular logic, its detachment from the world. What I remember has the texture of a dream, an invention, a strange and weightless suspension like walking on the ceiling. In my childhood, I'd hold a square mirror up to the ceiling. I examined every inch of this flat, white expanse, entirely removed from the jagged world on the opposite pole where people lived in shadows, weighed down by troubles. I understood that all anyone can do in the midst of darkness is retreat to their own bright landscapes. I think more and more these days that I should set down some of the facts of my friendship with M to keep something of this time intact. But stories are reckless things, blind to everything but their own shape. When you tell a story, you set out to leave so much behind. And I have to admit that there is no shape in those long walks and conversations, even if I think of them often. Let me place the photograph here as the tangible remains of our friendship. What follows is an incomplete inventory. And then the inventory begins.
Thank you for reading that. I love the beginning of this. It frames the whole story and it tells us so much about it, as well as sort of undermining what it's telling us right away. You know, the doubts about memory come in from the start. Can you talk about the origins of the novel? There was an interview you gave to, I believe it was Shakespeare and Company in Paris that we listened to a bit in my class. Some of the questions there provoked some discussion, and one was about the very different form that this novel had before it had the form that you gave us today. Can you talk about that?
Well, it used to be a much longer novel, more than twice as long as this book. And it was in the form of a letter from Nunu to M. And there was no dialogue. I think there were like no paragraph breaks even. And the reason I chose the form was to create a sense of memory. And I don't know why I thought that memory was this big blob of language. But you know, it can be many things, or you can visualize in many ways. And that draft of the book was called Taller Shadows Fall, which I thought was very poetic. It's a line from a Virgil poem. And a friend of mine who hadn't read the book, who's very new agey, said that the title had a bad aura. And she said, you know, you're never going to sell this book if you don't change the title. So, and because I was superstitious, I said, okay, I'll just change the Word document name and I'll keep my title. And in that first draft, there was one part, just like a fun part I'd written about the narrator going on walks on the ceiling, but it didn't really have anything to do with the book. It was primarily about Nunu's father's youth in Paris and Nunu trying to understand that time and understand what happened to her father. And then, you know, I wrote little bits about her childhood. And I asked,
Ayşegül, can you hear me? It looks like you've frozen. I'll see if I can message her directly.
So there's a lot of traffic on the internet today.
She did say she was at a country house outside of Paris, so perhaps the internet on her end has slowed as well.
It looks like she left and maybe is going to try and reconnect.
All right. Our Zoom reality continues to shape our experience.
There she is. There she is. Back on.
So anyway, I called it Walking on the Ceiling. And the moment that I named the document that, I also knew something about my narrator, that she was escaping reality, and she kept on evading it in different ways. And she kept on going on walks on the ceiling, which I thought was also what she was doing with M, that these walks were a way for her to look away from something that she didn't want to face. And the moment I knew that, I also knew how I could write the book in a way that wasn't the concrete blob of memory, but something a bit more readable.
Do I understand right that at some point it was a letter from Nunu, the narrator, to M?
It was, yes.
So one of the students in my class, Christy, asked, what do you think the disadvantages or advantages would have been if it stayed as an epistolary form, a letter or a series of letters? Did you think about that anymore, or did you just get rid of that altogether?
It's more intimate, I think, if it were an epistolary form. And I think her relationship with M, just because of writing to him, would have felt very different, and it couldn't have been retrospective. I mean, Istanbul being a present sort of moment of tension in the book, I don't think I could have done that, because she would be writing in Paris, or maybe, years after writing to M. The really difficult thing about writing a novel, writing a letter, is you're constantly reminding the person you're writing to about things they already know. Like, remember that time we met at the Luxembourg Gardens and you said this and I said this. I never write letters like this, so I couldn't pull it off. There are some books I love. One big inspiration for this book was Memoirs of Hadrian, where the Emperor Hadrian is telling his life to Marcus Aurelius, but Mark doesn't know what the emperor has been through, so he's listening as a younger man and absorbing the wisdom, whereas M and Nunu have gone through their walks in Paris together. I was sad. I hope one day to write a letter form book.
Yeah. It is a very particular form, because you have to make it seem like it feels like letters, but you have to do all this work of exposition for the reader, and it becomes quite a challenge, I think. One of the other things that came up around this idea that the novel started as an epistolary form, this is from Tanya in my class, was the question of reliability, because you still have letters in the novel. M and Nunu, in between their walks, they write to each other, they email each other. And there's a question of Nunu as a narrator who is telling the truth or not, right? We know she doesn't always tell the truth to people in her past, about her past. So I wondered if you would talk about this idea of narrative reliability in storytelling, and how you thought about it as you created this voice for your narrator.
Carl, didn't you say at the beginning, like at the very beginning of that workshop, that there's no such thing as a reliable narrator? I'm almost sure I took that from you, and so I've always given that answer, that all narrators are unreliable, and as long as you're not tricking the reader or complicating things for them in a way like that they have to stop and figure things out and they can't continue reading the book, an unreliable narrator basically means a complex narrator. And if they were very reliable, I think you should also be cautious of that. How is this person, how much psychotherapy have they done that they are completely able to speak the truth?
I may have said that. I don't remember, but it sounds like the kind of grand statement I might have made to the class at some point. Complex is a great word, because we really spent a lot of time in my class discussing this central relationship of the book, M and Nunu. So Nunu is a younger woman. She's from Turkey. She's living in Paris. She seeks out a friendship with M, who's an older, I think, white British writer, if I understand correctly, and much established, although he's written a lot about Turkey. And the nature of their friendship was much discussed in class. And so, without fully asking you to explain that relationship to us, can you talk about how you went about creating it on the page, this I would say sort of unconventional friendship, And also if you want to say anything about how you developed it and if you knew it was going to lead in the direction it does, which is that it ends with their estrangement.
I didn't know that it would end with their estrangement. I did know that I wanted to complicate the power dynamics, that it wasn't just, you know, an older man and a younger woman and the type of relationship one would expect from that, because that would be a boring story if you sort of guessed from the beginning, yes, this is, you know, he'll want to sleep with her, and, you know, she might say yes because she admires him, or she might say, so I wanted to complicate that, and I didn't want M to be a villain, and I wanted there to be the power relationship to go both ways. That yes, M is older and he's written books that Nunu admires, but Nunu's younger and charming, and she's a native of Istanbul, so she has a direct lineage to M's subject matter. The estrangement, I guess, was inevitable just because I didn't want to end up in a predictable relationship or a predictable ending. And, you know, it's true that, of course, there is attraction in their relationship, as there is, I think, in every friendship on some spectrum. And so I wanted to play with the various degrees of that attraction and how it can be played with.
Was there anything in their relationship to you? I don't want to reduce your characters to types, but in terms of an older Western white man and a younger Turkish Muslim woman, was there anything symbolic in the kind of relationship, say, between, I don't know, Turkey and France or Turkey and the West? That was another thing that was, I think, highly speculated on in our class. You know, is there a kind of examination of colonialism or anything like that, intentional in your portrayal of the characters?
I think Nunu might not think of it as colonialism, but I think she would think of it as sort of a learned admiration of Europeanness that she's seen from her grandparents and from her mother's aunts and from her parents, that, you know, European things are so civilized and Paris is the most beautiful city. But M also has this. As a European man, he also admires Paris. So on the one hand, there's this idea of a mythical city that I think about a lot, the city that's imagined. And on the other hand, there is the city itself. And I think Nunu keeps on wondering, wait, am I seeing the real city? Is this what everyone's admiring? Or am I missing something? Or am I not seeing the full picture? So I think there's that sort of, in her admiration, she certainly wonders that.
It's a great novel of the city as a landscape. You know, they go walking, they observe, they name things. Some of them are the typical things, you know, Notre Dame Cathedral is there to be looked at, but it's looked at differently, right? She's taught to step back and see it from a different angle.
Yeah.
And Istanbul is also a city depicted with great change. And one of our students, Swetha, asked, she says, there's a passage in your book on page 33 where you mention about a surge in the number of books on Istanbul and how Turkish writers began to discover the city with fresh eyes. As someone who grew up in Turkey, how did your view or perception of Turkey change, and how did it influence your writing? So there's a lot of questions there about the change in Turkey and how you observed it and how it made its way into your book. And perhaps we are frozen again. We are definitely being challenged today by technology.
Well, it's a miracle that, you know, we're able to have somebody join us from 8 time zones away.
Yes.
Hopefully we'll get a restart.
Yeah. And of course, if anyone has questions and wants to put them in the chat, I've got plenty here, but I get a little tired of my own voice. So anyone else who wants
I'm
to
back.
ask. Did you get that last question I asked?
I did. It's such a huge question. The writer, you know, all these books being written about Istanbul. When I was writing that, I was really thinking about the time that around the time that Orhan Pamuk won the Nobel Prize, it seemed that there was a lot of democratization happening in Turkey. It was a sort of safely exotic place to visit, and it was sort of a great example of people living together, like Andalusian Spain or something. And things changed very swiftly from that time. It was around 2005, I think, to, this is me with dates, but 2005 to the start of the Gezi protests, I don't know, 2014. And I was writing the novel during the time of the protests and extreme censorship in Turkey. And I was writing about this mythical Istanbul and Nunu's grandparents' Istanbul and the admiration for Europe and this desire to be European. And I thought that there was something a bit artificial about it when so much was changing in Istanbul at the same time, which is why I wanted to bring in the present moment. So Nunu's writing right after the stifling of the protests, this around the same time as the Arab Spring. And even though she doesn't say specifically what's happening, I wanted to have that as an atmosphere, some, you know, line of sort of claustrophobia in the novel and uncertainty, which I think still is the case today.
Would you mind reading from that section on page 33? It's when Nunu goes to the bookstore to meet M or to hear him read, and winds up instigating their meeting.
You mean this was a time, that part? Oh, here, I'll read from this. For many of us, the host said, Istanbul is a mythical city. It's Constantinople, it's the fallen Rome, it's the meeting point of East and West. He remembered his first visit to Istanbul. There had been many more visits after that, he said. One couldn't help falling in love with the city. He had the feeling of walking through history, through entire empires and civilizations. Several people in the audience nodded vigorously, eagerly affirming the impression of their own visits. This was a time when Istanbul's name was popular around the world. Much was made of its diversity, the so-called meeting point of two worlds. All of a sudden, there were books upon books about Istanbul and its sad and glorious past. In these books, it seemed, Istanbul was always sad and glorious, as if the city had done nothing but decay from an unseen splendor. Even Turkish writers had begun to discover their own city with fresh eyes. That period has mostly ended by now. Those were better times.
Thank you. I love this idea that the cliches of the bridge between East and West and the sad and glorious fading are sort of being contended with, because it seems to also tie into the personal relationships of Nunu at a later stage in her life, trying to look back and remember how to characterize this friendship with M. Did you think about paralleling the history in the cities with the kind of interpersonal relationships with the characters? Is there something in that for you?
I did, although the more truthful answer to why I wanted to write about these two cities is because I thought that would be a great way to fit in everything I wanted to write about. And I thought if you have a book that's, you know, structured around walking, then you can do so many lists. You can do lists of conversations, lists of foods, lists of streets, lists of landscapes. And I don't know if you would feel this too, but there is a way in which a first book is very different from, I think, the books that follow, that there is this optimism that you can really fit everything inside a first book, and everything you found beautiful and interesting. It's like this, you know, like a treasure box of your collection as an artist coming of age. So I think that's why I picked Istanbul in Paris, and I thought this is a great structure, because I really, you know, I have these notebooks upon notebooks of things I've been wanting to say for years, and these little tidbits, so I can fit that in. If I have 2 cities, I can fit even more in. And then I think after a first book, you begin to be a bit more rigorous in your style and the structure and what you're capable of doing. I think you sort of understand your own capacity, and that you won't be able to fit an entire world into a book. And you say, okay, I'll just settle for this one thing. But I think in the first book, you're still sort of hoping that it might happen.
I think it's optimism, but I also think it's the worry that there may not be another book, so get it all in right away. I always tell my students when they're struggling in workshop with writing their first book, that one of the reasons they're struggling is because they have not yet proven to themselves that they can do it. Right? There's no evidence you can complete a book, right? And once you have, then you know you can at least complete one, and you can try to do another one after that. Did you, I want to talk a little bit about your journey as a writer, because I know a lot of our MFA students are wondering this very thing, you know. Who were you when you started the MFA program at USF, and who were you when you finished? Had you changed? Had your sense of yourself as a writer changed? That's my first question about this.
When I started the MFA program, I had written nothing except for my application stories. So I was and I had never taken a literature class or a writing class at university. So I was a reader, and I was very certain about what I liked to read. And I was very uncertain about what I should be writing. And I think one thing that was very, very difficult for me was knowing whether there was some, you know, authentic story that is a story that only I could write, which, you know, is something that you hear. This is your story. Only you can tell this story. Like, write what you know. I was like, but I don't know what that is. And what I was doing, and actually I'd like to read something to you. What I was doing during the MFA was, I just said, okay, I am going to imitate the writers that I really love and see what comes out of that. And which became a problem, because there were 2 groups of writers I really loved. There were, on the one hand, these are short story writers, and I was writing short stories. There was Alice Munro and William Trevor in one camp. So I was writing sad and slow and wistful, realistic stories. And on the other camp, there was Bolaño and Borges and Stephen Milhauser. And I would write, and Calvino, I'd write these sort of dry stories from the point of view of middle-aged men, very metafictional, and always like centered around some sort of like a puzzle or some idea. And when I was working on my thesis in the summer, I'd ask Stephen, which one should I pick? Like, which one's my voice? the Borges or the other one? And I want to read something, an email that Stephen sent me after Walking on the Ceiling came out, and well, after he'd read it. This is Stephen. It was so great for me to see the way your writing has evolved, the degree to which you have found your own way to create the voice that it seems to me you were struggling with back at USF. What I'm trying to say is that it's very much the same voice. And in those days, as you would say, you had your Borgesian stories and you had your melancholy realist stories, neither of which ever seem to entirely satisfy you. The novel isn't either of these things exactly, but exists in between in this way that is very much yours. So I think a big part of my journey was, Stephen, I hope you don't mind. He then went on to say that he was proud of me, which was one of the greatest praises I've ever received. But I think during the MFA, I was thinking about finding a structure that would house the content or the story that I wanted to write. Whereas I think for me, the more important aspect was to find any structure or any story or any landscape that was flexible enough that could house my various voices. And I think this is somehow an easier way for me to think about writing and think about the structure of a book. And so this is sort of the greater journey. Practical journey is that I was very uninspired after the MFA for several years, and I didn't know what to do. I said, well, I wrote these stories and I worked on them with someone, and now I have no one to read them. And I don't know if I should keep going, if I should write short stories, if I should write a novel. I mean, I think there's only one answer to this, that yes, you do some tutoring job or whatever job, and you continue reading a lot and you continue writing, and you hope that something will emerge from that. I didn't also think about the business side of things really until I had a novel. I didn't think like, oh, well, if if only I had an agent, then then I'll produce a book.
I also was looking at some letters I had written to you in workshop, and I want to read something to you from that as well, if you'll indulge me here. This is about a short story. I don't remember which one.
Ottoman.
Well, there was Ottoman, there was the Sheik, and there was another story. This says, this is my writing to you. The repetition of objects and actions, balcony, caterpillar, ice cream, peeling, comes to suggest over the length of the story the remnants of time. These are all that is remembered from a distance, a few images, a few actions, a few snippets of voice. This sounds a lot like walking on the ceiling to me, including the balcony and the ice cream.
And the repetition of objects.
Yeah,
that, sometimes memory can only be just some object and what that signifies, or how pathetic it appears after so many years. I think that was in many of my stories then.
A couple of people have been chatting privately here with me with some questions, so I'm going to switch gears and ask. This one's from Jake Warren. He writes, you seem to know exactly how much distance to place between yourself as a writer and your characters on the page, even if you identify closely with them. How do you know when you found the right distance? I guess that's a question about narration and point of view as well.
I think for walking on the ceiling, I found that distance once what I described about knowing that Nunu was always walking on the ceiling, and that her way of being in the world was sort of being in a different dimension and playing a game. And the moment I knew that that was something that was separate from myself. I also knew that I could create a very distinct voice for that type of behavior. And I think that because Nunu is very similar to me. She was in age when I was writing it, the fact that she's lived in Istanbul, and she now lives in Paris, or she had lived in Paris. I think it was Nunu's voice, and which came after, by the way, many drafts. And probably the earlier drafts would have sounded like an undistinct character and sort of an undistinct monologue whose characteristics resembled me as an author.
Here's another question. This one's from Jesse Hurwitz. On page 22 in chapter 9, you write, I still remembered what it was like to live with a creative mind. I said, how it hovered above us. And Jesse asked, I was curious about this idea of living with a creative mind. Does this refer to Nunu or her father? Was there an inspiration for this? Is there a power? I'm sorry. And is there a potential resolution to living with the creative mind?
Well, there Nunu's talking about her father and the fact that, but again, this is a myth about her father, that her father is a poet, and the reason he's so silent and the reason he's not participating in family life is that he is creative. When in reality, probably the father was suffering from depression. But it's one of the mythologies of the book, like the mythology of Paris, the mythology of why the father is the way he is. And I mean, one of the echoes of that, of course, is Nunu's relationship with M, and the fact that she thinks, well, you're a creative person, and therefore you would be able to take my very murky and cloudy story and make something more understandable, clearer from this material. So I don't think there is really a resolution, because she gives away her own responsibility of living with a creative mind.
Yeah, and of course the creative mind of her father is quite different than M, because her father is not really a writer in the way that M is a writer, and meets quite a different end. Though I don't want to spoil the book for anyone who hasn't read it yet. The other important figure we haven't mentioned, and probably the person that most fascinates me, is Nunu's mother. My friend Graham, who is a theater maker, he and I read this book together. We had our own little Zoom book club of two. And he observed, he said, you think it's a novel about Nunu and M, but it's really a novel about Nunu and her mother. And I love that observation, because somehow this friendship with M, this walking through the city, this listing of everything they see in Paris, sends her back to all this unresolved stuff with her mother. How did you draw the connection between those two relationships? Did they develop together or separately? Is there any way to answer that?
They developed somewhat separately. When I was writing the first draft, and I was so concerned about figuring out the logistics of, what year was Nunu's father in Paris and what happened to him, what was happening in the Turkish Republic during that time. It was a very sort of plot-driven, I suppose, story with very little emotion. And in the brief glimpses I was writing of Nunu's childhood and her memory, the mother would come in, and someone pointed out to me that I was writing with a lot more emotion when I wrote about the mother, and I really sort of the subject matter there seemed richer. So I already had I decided to focus on the mother. The one thing that was similar for me in building M's character and in building Necla's character, Nunu's mother's character, is that I, again, didn't want to simplify the dynamic of, child abuse, that, this was a bad mother and Nunu is traumatized because of how her mother treated her, or because of her mother's depression, which is why first of all, she's questioning her memory. And she's, for every bad thing that she remembers about her mother, there is also something she says, wait, there were those evenings where she'd put on her reading glasses and we would just sit around and it would be totally fine. Am I misremembering things? She also has had a boyfriend, Luke, that is very into turning histories of self into some form of therapy and labeling them and saying, this is what happened to you, and this was the type of relationship. And I think part of the process of the book is Nunu's trying to unlearn what she's come to believe is true during her relationship with Luke.
And Luke gets quite upset when she when she doesn't sort of proceed according to the way he sees her relationship, understands her relationship. Yeah. This is a question from Emily in my class. She said, my question is about your writing process. Is it a character, idea, or something else that gets you started with a story? What inspired Walking on the Ceiling? And then this, I think we haven't gotten to, this last question, what inspires you now?
There's a very specific inspiration for Walking on the Ceiling, which is that I went on a walk with a writer, but I didn't know this writer at all. And I had in my mind the idea that going on a walk with a writer was a writer that I admired. I'd read his work. It was a very important thing, and I would know what to do after this walk. It was totally unlike what I imagined. He wasn't very nice. He was very tired. He didn't really want to go on a walk. I was supposed to write an essay at the end of our walk. And he said exactly the opposite of the things I expected him to say. We were supposed to talk about a Hart Crane poem that I liked. And he said, you know, I really don't like Hart Crane. And I think this poem is terrible. I don't know what it's saying. It was a terrible disappointment. And I think it was that terrible disappointment that was the inspiration of deciding, okay, well, now I can't write this essay I had in mind. And yet I could write the story of going on a walk with a writer and why that is so exciting. The interesting thing is, I don't know if Stephen or you, Carl, would remember, is that I also would write stories of like going on walks with writers. This was one of my tropes. And I think I had a story about going on a walk with Orhan Pamuk and all the things I would show him in Istanbul, trying to prove to him that I knew Istanbul but better than he knew Istanbul. And he'd like stolen all the subject matter and written about it. And yet I still had, you know, some hidden places. So even when I went on the walk, I think my imagination came first. I already owned that topic of going on a walk with the writer. So when it happened, I was looking for a story. I was looking for some form of fiction in the walk, which I think is why it was so powerful. What inspires me now? Let's see. Well, I'm working on a novel. I'm not really sure where it's going. And what inspires me is I'm constantly reading and hoping that I'll see something that somehow belongs to the universe of what I'm trying to write. And I don't name it. I don't say like, oh yes, it's because, you know, it's told in the present tense or it's about this subject matter. And once I've found this book, it's several books, they're on my writing desk and, you know, I pick them up. Right now, there are 3. And since I'm not at home, I found them online and I read them online. This is my big inspiration for I think longer works. For short stories, it's often I'll hear a story or I'll have an experience, and very soon, you know, like a week later, I'll know the structure of this is so perfect for writing a story, and that is very quick. Those are my 2 inspirations.
You have another novel coming out, which I read on your website. When can we expect that? And do you want to give us a preview of it, or would you rather have us wait? I know nothing about this.
It's called White on White. It's coming out, I think, in the fall, in 2021. And it's about an art history student who is in an unnamed city and is researching medieval nudes and, you know, the concept of nudity in medieval art. And she's renting the apartment of a painter. The painter isn't there. The painter arrives halfway into the book and starts speaking. And the rest of the book is told in the painter's monologues and the painter's unraveling. So it's a parallel story of psychological unraveling, and the concept of being naked as a human and what it means to be naked as a human, which I think is something that I was thinking about when I wrote Walking on the Ceiling. The way that, you know, the stories we tell add layer upon layer to who we really are and to our sort of sincere selves or authentic selves, if there is such a thing.
We've just got a few minutes left, so I want to ask another question about publishing, because of course so many of our students are very interested in how anyone gets published at all. You said that you didn't pursue publishing until you had the draft of Walking on the Ceiling. Can you talk about what you did from there? Did you cold call agents? Did you make connections in other ways? What did you do, and what would you do differently?
When I had the first draft of when I had the first draft of it was called Taller Shadows Fall, I sent it, I had no connections and I hadn't thought about it at all. On our very last class, Stephen gave us a query letter that he had sent to agents. And I had folded up, you know, moving from San Francisco, from Palo Alto to Paris, it was so like safely stored away somewhere. I basically copied it and sent 5 emails to, you know, what agents I found online. And they all rejected me, but one of them said, I like your voice, which I think in writing, you have to take these rejections in very optimistic ways, and you have to continue tricking yourself into believing that that's a really great sign. So I remember for the following 4 years, I would go around saying, well, this agent is waiting for my revision, which wasn't the case at all. She had just said, I like your style. So I revised the novel. I sent it back to her, and she said, yes, still not taking it. At that point, I was devastated, and I'm married to a mathematician. He wrote an algorithm to search Google for certain keywords, and the keywords were experimental, international, female. It was horrible, and he pulled out like 60 or 70 emails of agents, and I sent the book, the revised book, to all of them. So, I mean, yes, it helps that the process was faster, but basically I looked online and I found agents that sounded like they might like my work. I did something else. I looked for books that I loved, and I looked at who represented those books, and I approached them and I said, look, you represent this author, which I really love. Would you like to look at my book? And I think this is a very effective method. In my case, sending out to so many was very, very useful. But again, I didn't do that until I really thought I had a finished product, just because it was so time consuming. And I can't see that you can write and read and then be, you know, writing query letters at the same time, because the language is very different and it would muddy your writing language. So my advice would really to not do it until you're totally ready and you have a book, and then sort of feel certain that when you've done your best, you will find an agent to represent you.
Experimental, international, female. Everyone should.
I don't even know if those keywords fit me. I mean, maybe, but yes.
Yeah. Well, it points out that we have to sort of take off this creative hat that we wear all the time and put on this kind of business and self-promotion hat and figure out how to talk about ourselves in our work at a kind of remove, right? Almost as if you're not the same person who is the artist.
Yes, exactly. And it's not a pleasant process. It's not a fun process, which is why I think if you have the luxury, if you're writing your first book and if you're still, you know, it's this wild and very joyful thing, I would take full advantage of writing that first book and not think about anything else, because the business side of it will come later. I haven't enjoyed any part of the businessy publishing things. So I I'm a bit nostalgic for that, the naive moments of thinking I can write anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And are you writing in English? I know you're bilingual, is this next novel and the one you're working on now all being written in English?
Yes, in English.
Yeah. And is there a reason that you write in one language over another?
Well, I think possibly the main reason is that Max and I speak in English to one another, and he doesn't speak Turkish.
That's your husband?
Yes. So I think that really is the main reason. But English is, I mean, it's not my native language, but I did learn it at a very early age and lived abroad growing up. So it's not a, you know, I don't really have to think about like how would I translate this? When I'm writing, I'm not translating from Turkish, but writing in English. So it comes easy. And in fact, you know, this idea of a narrative distance, I think writing in a second language is also that narrative distance, that if I were writing in Turkish, I might feel that it was a bit too familiar. And if I were writing about a character like myself in my native tongue, it might almost become too much of a diary or too gossipy, which isn't always the case in English, especially because when my mother reads it, she'll be hearing it in a foreign language, so she won't think this is my daughter speaking. She'll think this is someone else's voice.
We must protect ourselves from our mother's reactions to our work at all times.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, if you ever want to write a gossipy novel in that voice, I would absolutely read it as well.
In Turkish?
Sure. I mean, write it in Turkish and translate it to English, and we'll see what it sounds like. The aunts in the novel are the kind of voices of gossip, right? The great aunts of Nunu in the novel are sort of the voices of gossip. And
yes, and you know, it's interesting because when I was writing the parts of the aunts, as well as some of the things that Nunu's mother says, I did think of that in Turkish. I would think, what would they be saying? And I would translate that. Because I really don't like when characters in a language that I speak are saying things, and I think you would never say that. That phrase or like that form of intimacy doesn't exist in that language. So I was also thinking, like, if this book were translated into Turkish, I want the translator to know immediately what that saying is or what that gesture is.
Yeah, those voices come off as quite different. And I really loved the moment where Nunu recounts sort of the times when she was surrounded by women growing up and the ways that women exist in the world together as a kind of almost a collective voice. It's quite lovely. Yeah. Well, we're just a couple minutes before 1 o'clock. Unless anybody puts another question in the chat, I have run my course. Ayşegül, is there anything else you would say to the MFA students who are gathered today? Anything else, any other advice, anything else you want to impart?
To enjoy this very, very luxurious time where you have amazing teachers to read your work and to guide you. And I would say if you have time and if this is 2 years that you can really focus on writing, I would say read as much as you possibly can. And I would also say try not to read too much contemporary fiction. Just because it's something, because you will end up reading it regardless. Like there's so much contemporary fiction. You can't sort of stop yourself from doing it, but it really is a way to protect your own voice and to stop it sounding like, many other writers and sort of in this bland consciousness of our times. I also want to say thank you so much for joining on such a joyful, historic day.
Yes. I think we can unmute everyone and they can make a little noise for you. I know I'm feeling quite good about our conversation and I hope others are as well.
Woo! Yeah!
Thank you all for listening to this conversation. I feel incredibly lucky to get to reunite with the next student on the occasion of her first novel, and I hope that anyone who wants to follow up gets a chance to. Dave, do you want to close this out, or Doug? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I can do it right before everyone goes. We have our next event of the semester a week from today, Saturday at noon again, I'm pretty sure. And this is with the novelist Rabi Alameddine and Anissa Halou, a food writer. It'll be mostly a conversation between them about food writing, research, travel. It's called A Feast of Words. So don't miss that, a week from today, same time. Other than that, just again, thanks everyone for being here. Thank you, Ayşegül, for coming back.
Ayşegül, thank you. And
yeah.
Carl, thank you.
Yes, Carl.
Thank you.
This was wonderful.
All right.
So that concludes that'll conclude our event. But if you want to hang out, of course, we can keep the chat open for a little while for those who want to chat. Thanks again, everybody. Enjoy your weekends.
Yeah.